A lot of people assumed the Duggar family legal troubles started and ended with Josh Duggar, but over the last few years, it's become obvious that the problems surrounding the family run much deeper than just one person. Behind the scenes, one attorney has continued showing up in nearly every controversy tied to the family, and now his own record is becoming part of the story. What's making this situation so serious isn't just another lawsuit or another courtroom appearance. It's the fact that the lawyer representing Joseph and Kendra Duggar is now dealing with major ethical scrutiny at the exact same time he's defending them in a high-profile case. The attorney at the center of all this is Travis Story, someone who has worked closely with the Duggars for years. He's handled everything from business disputes to criminal matters, real estate problems, and bankruptcy cases. But recently, his reputation took a massive hit after Arkansas legal authorities formally reprimanded him over allegations tied to professional misconduct and malpractice. The disciplinary action came after a businessman accused Story of mishandling a bankruptcy case so badly that it allegedly led to enormous financial damage. According to the complaint, the client hired Story to help protect a property worth more than $2 million during a Chapter 11 bankruptcy process. Instead of helping reorganize the debt and stabilize the situation, the lawsuit claimed that critical deadlines were missed, required filings weren't completed properly, and communication with the client practically disappeared. Eventually, the property went into foreclosure. The client later alleged that he never received proper warning before the situation spiraled out of control, leaving him forced into a much worse financial arrangement just to recover from the damage. The Arkansas Disciplinary Committee didn't treat the accusations lightly. Story was formally reprimanded for multiple violations connected to his handling of the case. The findings included failure to provide competent representation, lack of diligence, failure to properly communicate with the client, charging unreasonable fees, and failing to properly protect the client's interests after representation ended. Legal authorities also determined that his conduct disrupted court procedures and delayed the administration of justice. On top of that, he was reportedly ordered to pay restitution and refund legal fees connected to the matter. What makes the situation even more concerning is that this wasn't an isolated issue. Similar complaints had already surfaced against him before. In fact, disciplinary action had been reportedly taken against him previously for related conduct involving missed deadlines, poor case management, and neglect of client matters. That history matters because disciplinary systems usually escalate penalties over time. A warning can become a reprimand, and repeated violations can eventually lead to suspension or even disbarment. At the same time all of this was unfolding, Story stepped into one of the most controversial Duggar-related legal situations yet by jointly representing both Joseph and Kendra Duggar. That decision immediately raised eyebrows among legal observers because joint representation in criminal-related matters is considered extremely risky, especially when two spouses could have conflicting interests. In situations involving allegations connected to children, family conduct, or criminal liability, attorneys are usually expected to avoid representing both parties together because what benefits one client may directly harm the other. That's where the conflict concerns become impossible to ignore. A lawyer representing both husband and wife at the same time cannot fully advocate against one client in order to help the other. If one spouse could reduce their legal exposure by distancing themselves from the other, cooperating with investigators, or even filing for separation, an attorney representing both clients is trapped. He cannot push one strategy without potentially damaging the other client's case. Legal ethics rules exist specifically to prevent that exact situation. Critics of the arrangement argue that Kendra Duggar may be the person most affected by this setup. Within the Duggar family's religious culture, wives are often expected to remain obedient and loyal to their husbands no matter what happens publicly or privately. Because of that dynamic, many believe Kendra is far less likely to independently challenge legal decisions being made around her. Some legal analysts have argued that if she had completely independent counsel, her attorney might advise her very differently than someone who is also representing Joseph at the same time. The situation becomes even more complicated because Travis' story already has a documented history involving conflicts of interest connected to Duggar business dealings. In one earlier case tied to a real estate dispute involving Josh Duggar and ALB Investments, Story reportedly faced disqualification concerns after questions emerged about his own connections to the company involved in the lawsuit. During that litigation, his relationship to the business became a major issue, adding to criticism that his professional relationship with the Duggar circle had become far too entangled. As more details started coming out about the legal situation surrounding Joseph and Kendra Duggar, people began focusing less on the accusations themselves and more on the strategy behind the defense. That's because in cases involving married couples, especially when children and household conditions become part of the investigation, prosecutors often look closely at whether one spouse had more responsibility or control than the other. And that's exactly where dual representation can become a serious problem. Under normal circumstances, separate attorneys would usually examine every possible defense for each client individually. One lawyer might argue that their client had limited knowledge of what was happening inside the home. Another might argue coercion, manipulation, fear, or unequal power within the marriage. But when one attorney represents both spouses at the same time, those defenses become extremely difficult to use because helping one client could directly damage the other. That's why legal ethics rules in many states strongly discourage this type of arrangement unless very specific waivers are signed. Courts know that conflicts can develop later even if both clients initially agree to share the same attorney. What looks cooperative early in a case can quickly collapse once plea negotiations begin or prosecutors start applying pressure. If either spouse later claims they weren't properly advised because their attorney had divided loyalties, the entire case can become vulnerable to appeals and accusations of ineffective counsel. For Travis' Story, this creates a dangerous situation professionally because his disciplinary record is already under scrutiny. Judges and prosecutors are fully aware of his recent reprimand, and legal observers believe the court may eventually force the issue into the open. Some expect the judge to require formal conflict waivers from both Joseph and Kendra, acknowledging that they understand the risks of sharing counsel. Others believe prosecutors could actively challenge Story's ability to continue representing both clients together. And there's another layer to all of this that keeps raising concern. Critics argue that Story's long relationship with the Duggar family may influence who his real loyalty is ultimately protecting. The Duggar family has relied on him for years across multiple legal and business matters, and some observers believe his continued involvement has less to do with legal strategy and more to do with preserving the family structure at all costs. In other words, keeping everyone aligned, quiet, and united may be more important than pursuing the best individual outcome for each person involved. That concern becomes especially important when discussing Kendra's position in the case. People familiar with the Duggar family's religious environment often point out how strongly women within that culture are encouraged to submit to male authority. Publicly separating from a husband, cooperating independently with investigators, or pursuing legal independence would carry enormous social and personal consequences inside that belief system. Because of that, some critics believe Kendra may never fully receive advice that prioritizes her own interests over protecting the family unit. Meanwhile, Travis Story's broader reputation inside Arkansas legal circles has continued drawing criticism because of the sheer range of cases he takes on. Attorneys typically focus on specific areas of law after years of specialization. Some only handle family law. Others dedicate their careers entirely to bankruptcy, criminal defense, real estate litigation, or civil injury cases. Story, however, has repeatedly appeared across wildly different legal categories at the same time.
Over the years, he's handled bankruptcies, divorces, criminal defense, real estate disputes, business litigation, and various Duggar-related controversies all simultaneously. That wide-ranging practice has led some critics to question whether he spreads himself too thin, especially considering the disciplinary findings tied to missed deadlines, neglected filings, and poor communication. In the malpractice case that triggered the formal reprimand, authorities specifically cited failures involving diligence and competence. Those are among the most serious criticisms an attorney can face because they directly impact whether a client receives proper representation. At the same time, old controversies connected to Story have started resurfacing online again. One of the biggest involves his association with Ecclesia College, a small Arkansas institution tied to a federal corruption investigation years ago. Several individuals connected to the scheme were eventually convicted or sent to prison after authorities uncovered bribery and kickback arrangements involving political influence and financial misconduct. Although Story himself was never criminally charged, his name reportedly appeared in documents tied to the broader investigation, and critics have repeatedly pointed to those connections when discussing his judgment and professional conduct. The Duggars themselves were also connected socially and financially to some of the individuals involved in that world, which only deepened public suspicion about how interconnected everything had become behind the scenes. Over time, critics began arguing that the same small network of political, religious, and legal figures kept appearing around multiple scandals in Arkansas. Now, with Joseph and Kendra's case moving forward, many are wondering whether the legal strategy itself could eventually backfire. If prosecutors or the court determine that conflict-free representation is impossible, Story could potentially be removed from the case entirely. And if the issue isn't addressed early, it creates the possibility for future appeals where either defendant argues that they never received independent legal advice in the first place.
What makes this situation even more complicated is that the concerns about Travis' Story aren't only coming from internet critics anymore. The legal system itself has already documented problems with how he handles cases, and that changes the conversation entirely. Once an attorney develops a disciplinary history, every new high-risk decision gets examined much more closely. Judges notice it, prosecutors notice it, and if another complaint surfaces while he's already under scrutiny, the consequences can escalate fast. In Arkansas, attorney discipline usually follows a progression. Minor issues can result in warnings or cautions, but repeated conduct creates a pattern. Once a formal reprimand is entered into the record, future violations carry much more serious risks, including suspension of a law license or permanent disbarment. That's why many legal observers were shocked to see Story immediately jump into such a sensitive and potentially conflicted case involving Joseph and Kendra Duggar only weeks after receiving the reprimand. The timing alone raised questions. Critics argue that a cautious attorney trying to protect their career would avoid any situation that could create another ethics complaint. But instead of stepping back, Story took on dual representation in a case where conflict concerns were almost guaranteed to be raised. That decision led some people to believe he was prioritizing his relationship with the Duggar family over protecting his own professional standing. And for the Duggars, loyalty has always seemed to matter more than outside perception. Over the years, the family has consistently kept the same close circle of advisors, attorneys, and religious figures around them, even during major scandals. Rather than bringing in independent voices, they often appear to rely on people already deeply connected to their world. Critics say that creates an environment where protecting the family image becomes the top priority, even when individual family members may need separate guidance or protection. A major concern surrounding Joseph and Kendra's situation is the possibility that Kendra's interests are fundamentally different from her husband's, even if she doesn't publicly acknowledge it.
In cases involving allegations connected to family environments or child welfare, prosecutors frequently examine which parent had more control, who made household decisions, and whether one spouse may have been pressured into silence or compliance. An independent attorney representing Kendra alone could theoretically pursue strategies focused entirely on her own protection and legal exposure.
But with shared counsel, those options become much harder to pursue openly. A defense that shifts blame towards Joseph could damage his case. Advice encouraging Kendra to separate herself legally or personally from her husband could directly conflict with Joseph's interests. That's exactly why conflict-free representation exists as a core ethical principle in criminal defense work. Some observers believe the prosecution may eventually force the issue into court directly. Judges have the authority to question dual representation arrangements if they believe fairness could be compromised. In some criminal proceedings involving married defendants, courts require both parties to formally waive future conflict claims after being warned about the risks. Those waivers are designed to protect the court later if one defendant tries to argue they received ineffective assistance of counsel because their attorney couldn't fully advocate for them individually. But even waivers don't always solve the underlying problem. If a conflict becomes severe enough during the case, judges can still intervene later. And if appellate courts eventually determine the conflict harmed the fairness of the proceedings, convictions or plea agreements can sometimes be challenged years afterward. At the same time, another issue quietly hangs over all of this: Josh Duggar's own legal history involving Travis Story. Critics have repeatedly pointed out that Story was involved in multiple Duggar-related legal matters before, including business disputes and federal proceedings tied to Josh. Some have argued that his close association with the family has blurred the lines between attorney and family insider. That perception became even more damaging after previous questions emerged involving business relationships connected to Duggar entities and legal representation overlapping at the same time. For many people watching this unfold, the deeper issue isn't just about one lawyer making questionable decisions. It's about a system where the same people continue protecting each other while outside accountability keeps getting delayed. The Duggar family built their public image for years around morality, faith, and strict family values. But as more legal controversies continue surfacing around people connected to them, critics argue that the public image and the reality behind closed doors look increasingly different. Meanwhile, Kendra remains at the center of growing public debate. Some people believe she's equally responsible for what allegedly happened inside the household. Others argue that women raised inside extremely controlling religious systems often have far less freedom than outsiders understand. Within that environment, obedience to husbands is frequently treated as a spiritual obligation, making it incredibly difficult for women to independently challenge authority, even when serious problems emerge. That's part of why so many legal analysts continue focusing on whether she truly has independent representation protecting her interests specifically. Because if her attorney's primary loyalty is preserving the Duggar family structure or protecting Joseph first, then critics argue the entire process becomes fundamentally unfair from the beginning. As the case continues moving through the legal system, the biggest question now is whether the court will eventually decide that Travis Story's involvement has become too risky to ignore. Even if Joseph and Kendra personally want to continue using the same attorney, judges still have an obligation to protect the integrity of the proceedings. Courts are extremely cautious about anything that could later turn into grounds for appeal, especially in cases involving family dynamics, criminal allegations, and possible conflicts between defendants. What makes this situation so unusual is that the warning signs were already there before Story ever stepped into the case. His disciplinary history was no secret. The reprimand had already been issued. The findings connected to neglect, lack of diligence, and communication failures were already part of the public record. And despite all of that, he still chose to represent both Joseph and Kendra together in a situation where their interests could easily diverge later.
Legal experts often say that conflict issues don't always explode immediately. Sometimes both defendants appear united in the beginning because they're trying to protect each other or keep a shared narrative intact. But as cases progress, pressure increases, prosecutors negotiate, evidence gets reviewed, responsibility becomes more individualized, and that's usually when attorneys representing multiple defendants run into impossible choices. If Joseph's defense eventually requires portraying himself as the primary decision-maker inside the household, that could hurt Kendra. If Kendra's best legal strategy involves distancing herself from Joseph or claiming she lacked power within the marriage, that could damage him. A single attorney cannot aggressively pursue both directions at once without compromising somebody's defense. That's why critics keep returning to the same question. Who is actually being protected here? Is the legal strategy centered on what's best for Joseph, what's best for Kendra, or what's best for preserving the Duggar family's public image and internal loyalty system? For years, the Duggars operated with a tightly controlled structure where problems were handled privately and criticism from outsiders was treated as an attack on the family itself. Former associates and critics have repeatedly described a culture where obedience, secrecy, and loyalty were emphasized above almost everything else. In that kind of environment, outside intervention becomes incredibly difficult because family members are conditioned to stay unified no matter how serious the allegations become. That's part of why this case has attracted so much attention online. To many observers, it feels bigger than just another legal controversy involving a reality TV family. People see it as another example of how insulated systems can protect themselves for years until legal pressure finally starts exposing the cracks underneath. And in this situation, those cracks are no longer limited to the Duggar family alone. They now extend directly into the attorney defending them. The concern surrounding Kendra has also continued growing because many people believe she may never publicly challenge the arrangement herself. Critics argue that women raised in highly restrictive religious environments are often taught that supporting their husbands is not optional, but a moral duty. Walking away, cooperating independently, or even questioning authority can come with enormous emotional, social, and spiritual consequences. Whether outsiders agree with that belief system or not, it heavily shapes how these situations unfold behind closed doors. At the same time, prosecutors and judges are not required to simply accept the arrangement without scrutiny. If the court believes conflict-free representation is impossible, intervention can happen regardless of what the defendants prefer. That could mean requiring separate attorneys, demanding formal waivers, or in extreme situations, removing counsel entirely. And if none of that happens now, the issue could still resurface later through appeals or ineffective counsel claims. For Travis' Story personally, the stakes may be just as serious as the Duggar case itself. Another ethics complaint tied to conflicts, negligence, or divided loyalties could place his law license in real danger after the disciplinary actions already on record. In legal circles, repeated patterns matter. Once regulators believe an attorney consistently ignores professional boundaries, penalties tend to escalate quickly. And that's why this story has become about much more than one courtroom battle. It's become a collision between legal ethics, family loyalty, religious culture, and public accountability, all happening at the same time. The Duggars spent years building an image of stability and moral authority, but the deeper investigators and critics dig into the people surrounding them, the more complicated that image becomes. Now, the family's longtime attorney is facing intense scrutiny himself, and depending on how the court responds, this entire strategy could hold together or completely unravel under the weight of its own conflicts.